"Taste the food," she said, right before pressing my face into the mashed potatoes. It happened in front of 132 wedding guests, right between the champagne toast and the first dance. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply closed my eyes as the heat from the potatoes clung to my cheekbones, and the murmur swelled around us like a wave too polite to crash. I sat there for 3 seconds longer than necessary, then reached for my cloth napkin, wiped slowly, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my untouched plate. That was the moment I knew. My place in this family was no longer at the table. My name is Evelyn Thomas, I'm 67 years old, and I used to believe in things like respect, tradition, and the importance of showing up for your children. Today was supposed to be my son's wedding, the happiest day of his life, and perhaps one of the final grand celebrations of mine. I bought a steel blue dress for the occasion, the kind with embroidery around the collar, just like his father would have loved. I'd spent the morning pinning back my silver hair, applying the same rose blush I wore to my own wedding decades ago. I arrived early to help, but they didn't need me, or want me. I was seated at table 12 near the kitchen doors. Not the family table. Not near my son. Just close enough to see the smile on his face and the woman beside him who had finally decided I was expendable. Haley. I had always tried to believe the best in her. When they got engaged, I offered her the necklace Jake had bought me for my 60th birthday, one of the few things I had of real value. She laughed and said it was vintage, in a tone that made it sound like junk. Today she wore a new diamond choker. I smiled anyway. I always smiled. Even when Jake forgot to introduce me to her parents. Even when the wedding slideshow played and not one photo of his childhood with me appeared on screen. Even when I was asked to sit out the mother-son dance because they were going for something modern. I held my smile through it all. Until the potatoes. The thing is, I didn't even criticize the food. I merely said it was warm and she said, "Then taste it." With that grin I'd seen too many times, tight, victorious, the way a predator smiles when the prey finally stops running. The room went quiet. Someone gasped. Jake looked away. That hurt more than anything. Not the mashed potatoes. Not the humiliation. The fact that my only son, my sweet boy who used to hold my hand when crossing the street, pretended it didn't happen. As if I had fallen forward on my own. As if I didn't matter. I stood up. Straightened my shoulders. Walked past the dessert table and out onto the hotel terrace. The autumn air bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. It was real. Honest. Unlike the people in that room. I leaned against the railing and stared at the garden lights. Somewhere behind me the music started. Their first dance. Haley had won. But she didn't know me. Not really. I had survived much worse than mashed potatoes. And I wasn't done. Not yet. The air outside the hotel smelled faintly of lavender and cigarette smoke. I stood there, hands resting on the iron railing, watching tiny lights flicker in the garden below like stars that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. Behind the tall glass doors, music swelled again. Laughter. Applause. I imagined them spinning across the ballroom floor. A picture-perfect couple under golden chandeliers, while somewhere on a linen-draped table, my chair still sat empty with a napkin stained by mashed potatoes. I did not feel angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt hollow. Not the kind of emptiness that comes from losing something. This was different. Like a room you have walked into 1,000 times, only to find all the furniture replaced with plastic replicas. Pretty on the outside. Useless within. I pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders and glanced down at my hands. Wrinkled, strong, steady. These were the same hands that packed Jake's lunch through middle school, wrote notes in his coat pockets when he had hard days, scrubbed bathroom tiles on her knees when she could have asked him to help. But she never did. Because she believed love looked like service. And now the boy she raised was a man who watched his mother get humiliated in public and chose to look away. Maybe that was the moment I truly began to understand. This had not happened all at once. Haley had been chipping away at my place in his life since the beginning. Small things. Quiet things. "Jake's too busy to talk right now," she would say when I called. Or, "We have our own traditions now." When I offered to host Thanksgiving, I told myself it was normal. That new wives needed space. That sons became husbands and husbands belonged to someone else. But belonging should not feel like banishment. I thought about last Christmas. I had mailed them a hand-knitted blanket, navy and cream, the same colors as Jake's college, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. No reply. No thank you. When I asked him weeks later if he liked it, he blinked in confusion. What blanket? He asked. Haley stood behind him in that moment, smiling. Oh, I think we left it at the old apartment. That was the first time I felt something inside me contract. But I ignored it. Just like I ignored the absence of my name in their wedding program, or the way Haley always introduced me as Jake's mom, and never Evelyn. I watched a couple walk past on the patio, hand in hand, whispering and giggling like it was their first date. I stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to interrupt their joy, not wanting to be seen. That was how I had begun to live lately, quietly, on the edges of other people's happiness. But tonight had pulled something sharp and undeniable into focus. I had been made invisible. Not by accident but by design. And not just tonight. Over years. Slowly. Strategically. By a woman who saw me not as family, but as competition. I had given her too much benefit of the doubt. Offered too many explanations for slights that were, in hindsight, deliberate. As the song inside faded into applause again, I turned away from the garden and walked toward the far side of the terrace, where a row of potted ferns offered a bit of privacy. I took out my phone, opened the photo gallery, and stared at a picture I had taken just that morning. Jake, 5 years old, holding a stuffed dinosaur, grinning up at me from a sun-drenched porch. I remembered that day like it was yesterday. I had made pancakes shaped like animals. He had told me I was the best cook in the world. He meant it. Back then. I stood there until the cold began to settle into my bones. Then I slipped the phone back into my purse, took a deep breath and re-entered the ballroom. The smell of vanilla cake and champagne greeted me like strangers who had once been friends. I did not look for Jake. I did not search the room for Haley. I walked slowly toward the table where my purse sat, lifted it gently, and left the napkin exactly where it was. Some stains should be seen. By the time I returned home that evening, the house felt different. Not quieter. Just colder. I turned the key slowly, half expecting some sort of comfort to greet me. But the lamp in the hallway blinked the same dull yellow it always had. My coat slid off my shoulders without resistance, landing on the same hook it always did. Everything was in place. Except me. I set my purse down on the entryway table and stood still, staring at the framed photo of Jake from his high school graduation. He had his arm around me, a crooked grin on his face, his cap slightly askew. Back then, he had wanted me in every photo. Tonight, he had not even glanced my way. I stepped into the kitchen and filled the kettle, letting the sound of water mask the thoughts rising in my head. The cupboard still held my blue china cups, the ones Jake used to call fancy teacups. When he was little, I picked one and placed it on the counter. My hands moved out of habit, but my mind was miles away, replaying each glance, each silence, each choice that had led us here. I thought about the wedding planning months ago. I had offered to help. Haley had smiled and said they had it all covered. You just enjoy yourself, she had said. But she had meant, stay out of the way. The signs were there. I just refused to read them. There was the time I brought over a family heirloom. A lace handkerchief passed down through generations of brides in my family. I offered it to her. She looked at it, nodded politely, and left it in the envelope. It never appeared on her bouquet. Never even left the envelope. The kettle whistled high and shrill. I poured the water and watched the steam rise. Chamomile. Calming. I held the mug but did not drink. Instead I walked to the living room where the fireplace sat unused. The mantel was lined with pictures. Jake at the beach, Jake in a Halloween costume, Jake with his first guitar. So many versions of him. All of them mine. Until they were not. I sank into the armchair and placed the mug on the side table. No television. No music. Just me and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had spent my life making room for others. For Jake. For his late father. For their needs, their dreams, their chaos. Now there was space everywhere, and I was not sure what to do with it. I thought about the look in Haley's eyes when she pushed the plate forward. It was not anger. It was victory. She had been waiting for a moment like that. A public show of dominance wrapped in a joke. And Jake? He had let it happen. That was the part that would not settle. Not the mashed potatoes. Not the napkin. But the silence that followed. The way he let it pass without a word. As if I was a stranger who had wandered into his life by accident. I reached into the side drawer and pulled out a notebook. The pages were mostly empty. I had once used it to jot down grocery lists, holiday menus, things to remember. I turned to a clean page and wrote today's date in the corner. Then I began listing everything I had given up to make sure Jake never went without. The summer trip I canceled so he could attend science camp. The savings I emptied to cover his car insurance when he got his first job. The time I stayed home from work to care for him through a fever. One memory at a time. One line at a time. My handwriting was steady. My breathing slow. I was not writing for anyone else. Not to prove anything. I just needed to remember who I had been before I started being erased. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly sweeping across the window. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. The tea was still warm. I took a small sip. Bitterness lingered, but it was manageable. I had tasted worse. The next morning I woke before the sun. The light had not yet spilled through the curtains, but my body stirred on its own. Restless in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, my robe wrapped tightly around me, the silence of the house pressing in. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing at the kitchen window. The world outside was still. Trees unmoved. Cars parked. The kind of stillness that feels both comforting and unnerving. As if the world was holding its breath. I thought about calling Jake. About asking him if he had seen what happened. If he had heard the way Haley's voice sliced through the laughter when she humiliated me. But I already knew the answer. He had seen it. He had heard it. And he had chosen not to act. There is a kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from realizing they were never really yours. I remembered when Jake was 9 years old and broke his arm falling from the monkey bars. He had cried the entire way to the hospital, clinging to me like I was the only safe thing in the world. Back then I was his home. Now I was an obligation. If that. I spent most of that day cleaning. Not out of necessity but because I needed to do something with my hands. I dusted every frame, scrubbed the grout in the bathroom, polished the wooden banister until it gleamed. Physical tasks had always helped calm the noise in my head. As I worked, my thoughts wandered back to Haley. Not just to what she did, but to how long she had been laying the groundwork for it. The first time she met me, she complimented my blouse and then immediately asked if I needed help picking out more modern pieces. At Jake's college graduation, she suggested I let the young people take the front row for photos because, "You are not great with stares." Each comment was wrapped in a smile. Each one left a mark. I had been allowing her to redraw the lines of our relationship with invisible ink. Lines I had only started to see once the light shifted. Later that afternoon, I received a message from my neighbor Helen. Just a simple note. Saw what happened at the wedding. You handled it with more grace than most people could have. It took me several minutes to process her words. Helen had been there. Which meant other people had seen it too. It was not just a private wound. It was a public dismissal. I typed back a short reply, thanking her, and stared at the blinking cursor long after the message had sent. Something about her message stuck with me. Grace. I had carried that word like a badge for years. Be graceful. Be understanding. Be patient. But what happens when grace is mistaken for weakness? I opened the drawer where I had placed the notebook the night before. The page was still there, the list of memories written in neat lines. I read over them slowly, each word anchoring me back to a version of myself I had nearly forgotten. I added one more line. I stayed silent when silence was interpreted as consent. Then I closed the book. That evening I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled like cut grass in early spring. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. A man walked his dog with a leash too long and a step too slow. Life continued. It always does. I walked past the community center and remembered when Jake used to take swimming lessons there. I had sat on those hard plastic benches, cheering every splash, every kick. I had believed that love would always be loud and visible. But now I was learning that sometimes love is quiet. Sometimes it walks away with its head high. Sometimes it remembers itself before others erase it. When I returned home, the sky had turned orange at the edges. I turned on a lamp, made myself a bowl of soup, and sat by the window as the last of the daylight slipped away. There would be no apology from Haley, probably not from Jake either. But there would be a reckoning. Not with noise, not with anger, but with something stronger. Memory. I was not going to be forgotten. 2 days passed without a word from Jake. No call. No message. The silence felt deliberate, shaped carefully like everything else had been. On the third morning, I received a notification that surprised me. An email. From Haley. The subject line read simply, "Clearing the air." I did not open it right away. I let it sit there while I finished my breakfast, rinsed my plate and wiped the counter clean. I wanted my hands steady before I read her words. When I finally opened the message, her tone was exactly what I expected. Polite, controlled, distant. She wrote that emotions had been high at the wedding, that jokes had been misunderstood, that she hoped I would not take things personally. There was no apology, just explanations dressed up as concern. She signed it with a heart emoji. I closed the email and stared at the wall for a long moment. It was strange how familiar her strategy felt once I recognized it. Minimize. Redirect. Move on. That had always been her way, and I had always let her. That afternoon I drove to the storage unit on the edge of town, the one I had kept since downsizing after Jake moved out. The unit smelled like dust and cardboard, like old seasons waiting to be remembered. I flipped on the light and stepped inside. Boxes were stacked neatly, each labeled in my handwriting. Jake's childhood, family papers, photographs. I pulled out a box marked documents and sat down on the small folding chair. Inside were folders I had not touched in years. Birth certificates, old tax records, insurance policies, and beneath them the file I had nearly forgotten about, the trust. Years ago, after my husband passed, a lawyer had advised me to put everything in order. I did. Quietly. Methodically. The house. The savings. Everything I had worked for. I remember Jake sitting at my kitchen table back then, nodding distractedly while I explained it. He had been young, newly independent. He trusted me to handle it. I trusted that he would always treat me with respect. I opened the folder and scanned the pages. Nothing had changed. No updates. No amendments. I had never felt the need to revise it. Until now. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back in the box. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. That night I received another message. This time from Jake. He wrote that things had been awkward since the wedding, that he hoped I understood how stressful the day had been, that Haley had not meant any harm. He asked if we could put it behind us and move forward. I read his message twice, then a third time. The words were familiar too. Avoid. Smooth over. Pretend. I typed a short response. I told him I needed time, that I loved him, that I hoped he was happy. I did not mention the wedding. I did not mention Haley. I did not mention the potatoes. Some truths do not need to be repeated. Over the next few days I began to notice things differently. Conversations I had brushed aside before now sounded sharp. Memories I had softened now stood out in clear lines. I remembered how Haley had once joked about how nice it would be if I moved somewhere smaller, closer to assisted living just in case. I remembered how Jake had laughed uncomfortably and changed the subject. I remembered how she had referred to my house as eventually yours, babe, when she thought I was out of earshot. I had heard her. I just chose not to respond. I spent an afternoon meeting with my attorney. We talked calmly, thoroughly. I asked questions. I listened. I made notes. I did not cry. When I left the office, the sun was bright and the street busy with people who had no idea how much lighter I felt. Knowledge has a way of doing that. That evening I sat at my dining table and opened the notebook again. I added new lines. Not about what I had lost. About what I was reclaiming. My voice. My boundaries. My place. I had spent too long shrinking myself to fit into someone else's comfort. That era was over. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into night. Porch lights flickered on. Somewhere down the street someone laughed. Life continued as it always did. And this time I was ready to meet it on my own terms. A week later I found myself standing in the grocery store aisle, holding a box of tea I no longer needed. It was the same brand I used to keep in the cupboard for when Jake visited. Earl Grey, his favorite. I placed it back on the shelf. It was not out of bitterness. Just practicality. He had not come by in months, and after the wedding, I stopped setting a place for him at Sunday dinner. I still cooked. Still lit a candle in the dining room. Old habits take time to unravel. But now, I cooked for one, and I sat at the head of the table without glancing at the empty chair beside me. That was the seat I used to save. I spent most of my days in a gentle rhythm. Mornings with coffee and news, afternoons tending the backyard garden, evenings with books or a quiet walk. I started saying yes to small things. Helen invited me to a book club. I went. The librarian mentioned a pottery class for adults. I signed up. My world, once narrowed to the outlines of a family that had outgrown me, was slowly expanding. One afternoon, while repotting a hydrangea near the front steps, I saw a car pull into the driveway. It was Jake. Alone. He stepped out of the car, hands in his pockets, eyes heavy. For a moment we just looked at each other. Then he walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "Mom," he said, voice quieter than I remembered. I nodded and wiped my hands on my gardening towel. "I should have come sooner," he added. I waited. He glanced down, then back at me. I do not know what I expected after the wedding. I guess I thought it would blow over like things always did. There it was. The pattern. Minimize. Move on. Pretend. I studied his face. The boy I raised was still in there, beneath the stubble and the guilt. But he was not a boy anymore. And I was not the same mother who absorbed every slight in silence. "I needed space," I said calmly. "Time to think." He nodded. "Haley thinks you are angry." I did not answer right away. The breeze shifted, brushing past the leaves. "I am not angry," I finally said. "I am clear." Jake looked at me as if trying to decode a language he had once known but forgotten how to speak. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. "Not now," I replied. "But maybe someday. When you are ready to hear things without defending them." He looked down again, nodded slowly, and turned back toward his car. He paused before opening the door. "You were always there for me, Mom," he said. "Even when I did not deserve it." I watched him leave. I did not cry. I did not smile. I turned back to the hydrangea and gently patted the soil around its base. That evening I pulled out the notebook again. I wrote one sentence. He came alone. It was enough. No grand gestures. No apologies tied up in ribbons. Just presence. Imperfect. Tentative. Honest. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. The dreams were soft and scattered, filled with distant music and the sound of water lapping against a dock. I woke with a strange peace in my chest. Not resolution. Just steadiness. A kind of quiet that felt earned. I went downstairs, made toast, and stood barefoot by the back door, watching the sunlight stretch across the lawn. The grass shimmered with morning dew. And in that small moment, I felt something return. Not what I had lost, but something older, stronger. The knowing that I could build a life that belonged only to me. One that did not require permission. One that did not shrink to fit someone else's comfort. And as the kettle hummed behind me, I turned to the kitchen, ready to begin again. 3 days after Jake's visit, a card arrived in the mail. Not an envelope. A card. Thick, cream-colored paper with a gold trim. The kind people choose when they want something to look formal, thoughtful, deliberate. My name was written in cursive across the front. Inside, the handwriting was Haley's. I recognized the way she looped her G's and crossed her T's with faint, dramatic flair. The message was short, polite, cold. She thanked me for attending the wedding and apologized. If anything that happened caused discomfort. Discomfort. A word you might use for a tight pair of shoes or lukewarm coffee. Not for what she had done. Not for what she had said. I closed the card without finishing it. I placed it back into the envelope and set it inside the drawer with the other things I no longer had use for. There was nothing left to respond to. I had said all I needed when I chose silence. And yet, there was something freeing in receiving that card. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Haley's story required a version of me that no longer existed. She needed me to be passive, quiet, forgettable. But I had changed. Not with fire. With clarity. That weekend I drove to the lake house. It had belonged to my parents, then sat untouched after they passed. For years, I had kept it maintained but rarely visited. It reminded me of long summers, family picnics, and a time when everything still felt whole. Now it felt like the right place to remember who I was before the noise. The drive was smooth. Just under 2 hours of winding roads, sun-dappled trees, and small towns with signs that had not changed since the 80s. I brought with me a small overnight bag, my notebook, and a tin of lemon cookies I had baked the night before. The house smelled faintly of cedar and lake water. I opened all the windows, letting the breeze carry out the dust of absence. That afternoon, I sat on the old porch swing and wrote in my notebook. Not lists this time. Just pieces of thought. Bits of memory. The way my mother used to hum when she folded laundry. The way my father always stirred his coffee 3 times, never more. The sound of Jake's laugh when he was 4 years old and thought knock-knock jokes were the height of comedy. These were the parts of my life untouched by Haley, untainted by recent years. Mine to keep. Mine to honor. I stayed 2 nights. I walked barefoot across the dock, watched dragonflies skim the water's edge, and made soup from scratch. No phone calls. No emails. No updates. Just space. On the second morning I found a small bird's nest tucked into the eaves. Empty now but perfectly intact. It made me smile. A reminder that even when things move on, the places we build love into can still remain. On my way home, I stopped at a local thrift shop and found a carved wooden box with a velvet interior. It was old but cared for. I bought it without hesitation. When I returned home, I placed inside it the few things that still mattered from my past. The photo of Jake as a baby, the letter my husband had written me one Christmas, and the key to the lake house. I locked the box and placed it on the shelf where I could see it. Not to dwell. To remember. That evening I hosted Helen for tea. She brought blueberry scones and news from the neighborhood. We sat in the sunroom and talked about books and recipes and the way spring always came slower in our part of town. She did not ask about the wedding. I did not offer. Some friends are made not by shared history, but by shared presence. After she left, I sat in the armchair and watched the sky change color. From amber to coral to slate. Another day come and gone. I felt no ache. No bitterness. Just space. Just peace. It turns out when you stop waiting for someone to make it right, you begin to make room for something better. Not what was, but what could be. And sometimes that is enough. One morning not long after, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was Jake. Not from his usual number, but from the landline at his office, judging by the faint clicking in the background. I just wanted to say thank you, he said without preamble. For what? I asked, my voice steady. For not slamming the door shut, he replied. There was a pause. I have been thinking about what you said. About being ready to hear things without defending them. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch. He continued. I am not ready for all of it yet, but I wanted you to know that I am trying. That I miss you. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me. Trying is a good place to start, I said. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway for a long time, the receiver still warm in my hand. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning. And beginnings are allowed to be small. That afternoon, I took out a set of recipe cards from the drawer in the kitchen. The ones written in my mother's script. Slightly faded but still legible. I picked one I had not made in years, her lemon chess pie, and began gathering the ingredients. As I rolled out the dough, I remembered the way Jake used to sneak pinches of crust before I baked it. I remembered his giggle when I pretended not to notice. The pie baked slowly, filling the house with warmth and citrus. I let it cool on the counter, then sliced a generous piece for myself and brought the rest to Helen's. She had her granddaughter visiting, and I knew the little girl would love it. Helen greeted me with a smile and a hug. Her home smelled of fresh laundry and lavender. We sat on her porch and shared the pie on mismatched plates, the kind with tiny flowers along the rim. Her granddaughter, a curly-haired sprite of a girl named Ava, danced barefoot in the grass, her laughter light and free. Watching them, I felt a calm contentment settle over me. Not the high of joy. Something deeper. Something rooted. Later that evening back home, I dusted off a small chest from the hallway closet. Inside were items I had not touched in years, old letters, costume jewelry, a pair of gloves from my wedding day. Among them was a sealed envelope I had forgotten, my husband's handwriting across the front. For a day when you need it. I held the envelope to my chest for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His words were simple. If the world ever makes you feel small, remember this. You are the center of ours. Always were. Always will be. My eyes stung but no tears fell. Instead, I folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it inside the wooden box I had bought at the thrift store. Some things are meant to be carried forward. The next morning, I called the local community college and asked about their writing workshops. There was one starting the following week. Memoir writing. Tuesday evenings. I signed up without hesitation. Felt right. Not for anyone else. For me. For the stories I had not told. For the voice I had almost forgotten I had. That afternoon, I went for a walk along the creek trail. The trees were beginning to bloom. Soft green buds pushing their way into the sunlight. Everything around me was shifting. Not dramatically. Not quickly. But undeniably. I walked slowly, breathing in the damp earth and the scent of early blossoms. And as I crossed the wooden bridge near the bend in the path, I smiled. Not because anything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for it to be. On the first night of the writing class, I arrived early and sat near the window. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old books. The kind of scent that reminded me of school libraries and quiet afternoons spent learning things no one could grade. A handful of other women filled the space, some younger, some older. Each with a notebook. Each with something they had carried silently for years. Our instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Carol, began by asking us to write one sentence. What truth have you lived but never spoken? I stared at the page, pen poised, heart oddly calm. Then without hesitation I wrote. I have spent years being generous with people who confused my silence for consent. The words sat heavy on the paper but not on me. For once I did not feel burdened. I felt seen. We shared what we wanted. Listened without interruption. There was something sacred about being in a room where no one was waiting to correct you. After class, I drove home in silence, the kind that does not ask to be filled. The porch light was already on, casting a soft glow across the front steps. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the quiet hum of a house that had stopped echoing. Everything had found its place. The next morning, as I watered the plants in the sunroom, I received a text from Jake. No long message, just a photo. It was a shot of him holding a cup of coffee with a post-it note next to it that read, "Trying. Still." I stared at the screen and smiled. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged everything. That afternoon, I visited the farmer's market and picked up a bunch of wildflowers. I arranged them in a glass vase and placed it on the mantel, beside the wooden box. Symbols, both of them. One of memory, one of bloom. That evening, I baked a loaf of rosemary bread and brought half to Helen. We sat in her kitchen, the radio playing softly in the background, and laughed about things that did not matter just to feel the warmth of laughter itself. On my walk back under a sky slowly softening into dusk, I thought about how healing often arrives dressed in ordinary clothes. A phone call. A class. A sentence spoken aloud for the first time. Not everything is grand. Not everything needs to be. I spent the next few days writing more often. Not always about the hard parts. Sometimes about simple joys. The way sunlight falls across the counter at noon. The sound of sparrows outside the bedroom window. The way a cup of hot tea feels when the world outside is cold. Life was not perfect. But it was honest. And I was no longer waiting for someone else to shape it. Had finally remembered what it felt like to belong to myself. And in doing so, I had found something better than forgiveness. I had found peace. One breath, one word, one step at a time.